Hi and welcome to the Geek Legion of Doom. This is a TV review. I'll be having a look at the Ultimate Spider-Man Halloween special. This is actually essentially 2 episodes kind of put into one kind of almost special extended version. And I believe it's episode 21 and 22 of the Ultimate Spider-Man series. So let's get one thing straight. Ultimate Spider-Man as a TV series is aimed at a younger audience. So I'm not going to be chastising the show because it's kind of a show that is aimed at kind of a younger audience, and I know it does get a lot of criticism. So a lot of people don't like it because it's kind of, juvenile and whatnot. Yes, okay, fair enough. That's a fair argument, but this show is probably not aimed at an older audience. But I still watch the odd episode here and there. And the reason I wanted to watch this episode is I'm actually a big fan of the character Man-Thing, and he actually features it in this episode, or at least the second episode. And you don't see him all that often on a kind of, certainly at these of anything other than the comics really, and even then he only pops up here and there. And it's nice to sort of kind of see him in animated form. I think he's only ever been in the Marvel superheroes kind of very, very young series before. So I was quite interested to sort of see what they would do with him, even though the Ultimate Spider-Man in itself is relatively kind of obviously aimed at a younger audience. So anyway, this basically the first part of this kind of 2-part episode arc is essentially Spider-Man and his kind of gang of heroes teaming up with Blade to take on Dracula and his kind of army of these kind of vampire creatures. And what Dracula basically wants is this kind of relic called like an ankh, and it basically will give him the power to basically survive in sunlight and kind of have vampire kind that survive in sunlight. And ultimately, Dracula kind of wants to sort of dominate the world, and this is obviously his plan to do it. So Spider-Man's initially a bit reluctant to team up with Blade because he feels Blade is probably a little bit too violent, because he's got no problem kind of slashing all these kind of vampires. Now, this obviously being a kid show, they've kind of got to redress that somehow. So they make a point of telling you that these kind of vampires were never human to begin with, and they were just kind of like creatures of magic and don't really have souls and things like that. So this is why it's okay to kill them, basically. Nevertheless, let's talk about Blade briefly. I actually think Blade was done quite well here. I have to say, I kind of quite like the way he was animated and his design, and they've still got his kind of like badass attitude. Now, Blade's obviously a character that sort of really came into prominence once obviously the Wesley Snipes films came out. And to be fair, it's probably one of the more well-known, if not the most well-known, out of kind of Marvel's like horror-type characters, if you know what I mean. So the initial part really is kind of the confrontation with these vampires, and then the actual Dracula himself. On to Dracula. So Dracula, the Marvel version of Dracula has changed quite a bit over the kind of the years that he's been in Marvel Comics. Initially, he was kind of much more of your traditional sort of like Hammer style Dracula, the little goatee. But in sort of more recent sort of adaptations of Dracula, if you've seen the kind of the Death of Dracula and the Mutants versus Vampire series that ran in the X-Men a little while, he kind of looks like that. So he's kind of got this like long white hair, and it's kind of wearing this kind of red armor, and it's kind of a lot more of like a lot more sort of built, and that makes it a lot more imposing. I actually quite like the design, and what I also liked was the way they kind of made Dracula, the voice that he'd done for him, the voice acting, and they genuinely made Dracula, I think, a fairly imposing force. And they actually make a point of, the Blade makes a point to Spider-Man saying he's not like, you're a supervillain. This guy is properly evil, and he's a different kettle of fish that's fighting supervillains who want money or what have you. So I quite liked Dracula, and as a sort of a kind of the Marvel version of him, and I thought it was well done. And what was quite good about this, obviously, this 2-episode arc, because Ultimate Spider-Man doesn't really do arcs as such. They're very much episodic, so they kind of, it being a kind of a longer story, it kind of gives it a bit more weight, and it gives Dracula that kind of the feeling he is a bit more of a threat than the kind of you might normally see in these kind of like more episodic episodes. And ultimately, in the sort of the end of the first half of this this special, Dracula ultimately looks like he's succeeding. He's got the ankh. He basically kind of mesmerizes the majority of the good guys. All but Spider-Man and Blade are kind of affected, so they're all kind of almost like mindless zombies helping Dracula. So we come to the kind of the second half, or the second episode really. And we've basically got Spider-Man teaming up with the Howling Commandos. Now this isn't the kind of the World War II Captain America Howling Commandos. This is actually a team of supernatural and kind of monstrous characters that you've got in the Marvel Universe, of which Blade obviously is probably, you can lump in with them. And you've got Werewolf by Night, you've got the Living Mummy, and you've got Frankenstein. You also have Man-Thing, although he doesn't actually appear until a little bit later on. And so they've kind of changed this quite a bit if you've read the comics and you're familiar with these kind of Marvel characters, because these are basically like the horror agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and they weren't. That was never really the case. And obviously all these sort of characters really kind of did their own thing and weren't really certainly working for the government. You occasionally had these kind of monster team ups and things, but generally speaking, they were pretty much did their own things. And I quite like the kind of the way they have. I like the Werewolf by Night. I thought he was quite good. He just looked like a regular guy. I thought he was going to be a lot more sort of feral, but from the pictures I'd seen beforehand. But I actually quite like the kind of the way they kind of done. They made that character and the kind of the way he looked. He was pretty decent. I wasn't so keen on the sort of Frankenstein character, who was kind of you're basically lummox, you're a big dumbass, and the kind of the Living Mummy. I've never really thought was a particularly interesting character anyway. This is probably why you barely ever see the Living Mummy anymore in the comics. And he's kind of almost like a kind of magical sort of character. But he is, they kind of do something with him in this, which I'll come on to in a bit. And they essentially go and try and attack Dracula and try and obviously save Spider-Man's friends, and also try and stop obviously the Ankh and stop Dracula's plan from kind of using the Ankh to get his abilities sort of enhanced and whatnot. And there's a bit of infighting with the team and blah blah. And they defeat Dracula. One of the problems I had I thought maybe they kind of defeat Dracula a little bit easily. Like when they kind of get to his lair and they sort of ultimately face him, he's taken down pretty quickly, which I was a bit surprised at, considering he seemed to be quite a big threat at the end of the previous episode. So I was a little bit disappointed with that, I've got to say. Man-Thing sort of turns up at this point, and they've way changed Man-Thing. He's kind of basically again a government agent ultimately. And he doesn't speak or anything, but he does kind of is able to kind of communicate and understand, which isn't really Man-Thing's character. So if you're very much a kind of purist, you're going to kind of be annoyed by some of these changes, but you probably won't watch the show anyway. But I kind of wanted to see what they did with Man-Thing in an animated form. He looks okay. He kind of looks pretty much like he would do in the comics. One thing I did like, they kind of did these like little character flashes when they actually did sort of introduce a character, and the art was pretty good as well when they did that. Anyway, they defeat Dracula, and then it turns out the Living Mummy actually had his own plans and turns on them, and sort of gets the Ankh and sort of grows up to be almost like giant man size. And so what they do is they kind of make Man-Thing by sort of plug him into the sewers and make him go huge, which he's not ever been able to do in the comics again. But I did like the kind of reference to the giant-sized Man-Thing comic, which was quite good. Anyway, and ultimately they sort of team up and defeat the Living Mummy and whatnot. So I quite liked it. I definitely thought the second half was weaker though, because it really didn't give you the kind of the threat that Dracula was in the first half of this episode. And obviously there's some significant changes to the horror characters. I love seeing the obscure characters on screen, because chances are you're never going to see them in obviously a kind of live action film, although we have had a Man-Thing film admittedly. But nevertheless, I kind of do like to see these kind of obscure characters sort of being dragged out from the kind of the Marvel vault. So it's kind of nice to see them. And I've always had a bit of a fondness for the kind of horror characters. Just shame Simon Garth wasn't on there, but never mind. Anyway, so I guess it was okay. I have to say I was a little bit disappointed, because I thought the first episode was quite strong, and it kind of made Dracula seem like a genuine threat, but he was kind of a little bit of a taken down very simply in the kind of the second episode. I actually wish they kind of didn't do the Living Mummy bit and kind of just made Dracula had a bit more of a kind of threat in regard to that. Also, some of the changes obviously that were made by the kind of characters will probably annoy, again, as I say, the purists. But it's okay. It was nice to sort of see these kind of like more obscure characters, I say. It's not going to change your mind about the Ultimate Spider-Man if you're not a fan of the series. But I just kind of like watching them as kind of guest characters that I'm into. So I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. Certainly not bad. It's worth a watch if you're a fan of the kind of the horror sort of Marvel comics. Let me know what your thoughts are. Leave me a comment. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.